traditional research project awards that are called career development awards. They have them for people at all different stages of their career. And there's a set that is designed specifically for people who are newly independent to help you get going on a new program of research. It's an interesting funding mechanism in that it's a combination of doing a research project just like you would in any R1 or R3 kind of research project mechanism, and specifically doing career development. So in order to get this kind of award, you have to identify something you don't know that you need to know to become the sort of scientist you want to become. And you sort of work on a dual track during the course of the award of doing career development and also having a program of research that you work on. The idea behind the award is that at the end of the 5 years, you should be ready to go out and get what most people think about when they think about an NIH grant, which is to go out and get an NR01 large research project grant. It's definitely a mechanism to think about if you're brand new and starting out, because you're not going to be competitive yet for the larger grants. Having foolishly tried to put one in at the beginning, I can very much attest to that. They sort of snicker and say some helpful things to you in your grant evaluations, but you're not at a current point to be competitive for that. So looking at those kinds of career development awards, NIH's version is called the K Award. There are also versions vetted in NSF. NSF has what's called a Clear Award. There are also different foundations that have those kinds of awards. In my field, for example, the American Heart Association and the American Cancer Society both have career development award mechanisms that very closely parallel what NIH does. In terms of thinking about funding right off, I think that's a really good place to think about beginning. There are some other mechanisms that are designed for new investigators. So some NIH institutes have what's called a B-Start Award, which is designed to get you going on research quickly, and there's a small grant funding you can think about. In terms of advice for getting grants, we were actually talking before the session that all three of us at various times have gone to the grant writing workshops at the Office of Research Start. Probably that is the number one thing that I would attribute to actually having been successful at getting external funding. I think my ideas are good. I think I need good research and all those sorts of things, but I really do think the difference is that kind of training for learning how to write grants and learning how to do it. One of the things that you should think about is that UNL is very much salivating to bring in new research funding, and because of that, they have a number of mechanisms available for helping you get grants. The grant writing workshop is one of them. Another thing that I took advantage of is that if you write your grants soon enough before the deadline, the Office of Research will actually send it to external reviewers for you and actually pay them a stipend and give you feedback about the grants, and that's something that I took advantage of a couple of times. What's nice about that is, just like when you write a paper, it's always a good idea to give it to somebody who's not you, before you send it out for review. You can only think so much about what's good and bad about your grant, and at a certain point, I think you become very blind to what the weaknesses are. Having a fresh set of eyes and having a set of eyes with somebody who would be serving on the grant panel is a great way to get feedback. I found that tremendously useful. In terms of other things related to funding, I have found that grant writing is a very different skill than journal article writing. The way that you're trying to phrase things, at least for me, is very different. You're trying to sell yourself as opposed to sort of report on research that you've already done. And I found them to be very different beasts. And starting to practice grant writing and looking at examples of successful grants and getting a sense of what it's like and how you do it well is tremendously important. It's not like you can sit down and write just like you would in a journal article. And then the only other real specific piece of advice that I would have for thinking about funding is that you have to realize that it takes a tremendously long time to get a grant. The K Award that I now have, I submitted for the first time in March of 2003. And it was successfully funded, and the funding started in July of this year. So they go in multiple times, you get feedback multiple times. Each time that you get feedback, you have to stop and think about what you're going to do and how you resubmit it. And so both in terms of your psychological well-being, you have to realize that that's the reality of the world. And then in terms of thinking about how you plan your research program, you want to think about what you're going to do in the interim while that grant is floating, because it does sometimes float for quite a long time. So that at least is what I think is the specific advice for the grant side of things. Started thinking about also advice on running a lab or doing research more generally. That was the other thing I needed to think about. And I fessed up to Mindy about this before the session, but I think the real answer to a lot of how do you run a lab, how do you do good research, what kind of advice she gives is try something and see if it works for you. If it does, try it again, and if it doesn't, go do something else. If there is a master plan, hopefully Sue or Rose will give it to you, because I certainly don't know. I feel like my entire career has been, a long system of figuring out what works for me and what doesn't. And if you look at the way I do research versus the way that other people in my department do it, everybody has their own way of working and things that work for you, and part of it is just sort of a system of figuring out what those things are. There's a couple of specific things that I would say, especially as a junior faculty member, somebody starting out the lab. One of the things that I've realized is that I spend significantly more of my time being a manager than I do being a scientist. And nobody ever really teaches you how to do that in graduate school, or it's a very rare advisor who does that in a systematic way. And so I've found it beneficial to try to think systematically and try to learn about management as much as I do about science. So spending time thinking about how you manage budgets, how you keep track of expenses, how you delegate to people, how you give feedback to people when they're not doing things well. I mean, all of those sorts of things that you would do in any sort of business setting, you really have to think about how to do in a lab. One of the ways you can frame what I do is that I'm a scientist and have graduate students working with me. The other way you can frame it is that I run a 20-person small business, and I have 5 graduate students who are direct reports, and I have total personnel of 20 people. And in some ways, the latter is at least as true as the former, and that's something that I found really beneficial that I never really thought about until I got into the midst of all of this. And then the other thing that I think you've got to think about very systematically is what you want your professional identity to be and how you're going to balance the multiple demands on your time to do those. And UNL is a research institution, and at least it should be on the videotape, we're not at least officially claimed to equally value instruction and undergraduate instruction in research. And you need to think about how you're going to live in the tension between those two things. So what kinds of compromises are you willing to make for your research program in order to do well as a teacher, and what compromises are you willing to make as a teacher to do well in your research? That, too, I think, just like the overall piece of advice, that there's no right or wrong answer for that, but depending on your professional identity, you have to decide where you want to achieve that balance. And then the other thing to think about is, especially when you're a faculty member, is figuring out who your mentors are going to be. If you're in a department that has an official mentoring program, you definitely want to take advantage of that. But what I've ultimately found myself doing over time is to try to identify multiple mentors, both informal and formal ones. So when I have a question about research, I go to a person who's different than the person that I go to if I have a question about teaching. And actually, the people that I tend to ask about undergraduate teaching, the people I tend to ask about graduate teaching are different. And you want to start to identify those kinds of people. Look for the people who have been successful in doing what you want to do and talk to them. And then the last thing I would say is, putting on my health psychologist hat for a moment, is that you have to realize that the entire thing is incredibly stressful, sometimes very demoralizing, sometimes leads to sleepless nights and all of those kinds of things. And I found it tremendously useful to have an exercise program, to think actively about how you're going to do stress control, to think about what the things are in your life that are not in any way related to your professional identity, so that when your professional identity isn't going as well as you want it to be, you have other areas of your life to fall back on. And thinking about those things as consciously as you do about your development is important, because it's the long road and only the beginning of it. So with that, I'll be honest, the other thing I thought about coming into this was saying, well, Sue Sheridan's on the panel and she's a lot more successful than I am, so I'm just going to pass and listen to what Sue has to say.
Thanks. Well, I was going to say what you said.
That's why I went first time.
I am more experienced because I am more senior than Rose Torres. I'm the old person on the panel. And actually brought me that. I know that there's probably going to be a lot of more interesting things to do than just listen to me talk, and so it's going to help me stay on track, and hopefully if you have any thoughts about what I'm talking about, we can even go further after we are finished with the panel. I'm Sue Sheridan, and I am the professor in the Department of Education Psychology. I'm also the director of the Nebraska Center for Research on Children, Youth, Families, and Schools. My approach to this talk today is really slightly different than Mark's in that and this is maybe a projective test, how we all interpreted Mindy's instructions, because I interpreted them in a way that she wanted to hear our story, why we got into what we got into, how our research has evolved and taken shape and grown over our careers, and it is really continuing work in progress, even though I've been doing this kind of work. I've been here for 8 years. I was at the University of Utah for 9 years prior to coming here, and got my doctorate in 1989, so I've been doing this kind of stuff for a long time. I still consider myself learning every single day and wanting to know more. So I think that's one of the take-home messages, how to be a learner. So the story behind all of that and how I got into what I'm into, I'll take just a couple minutes with, and then I'll go into just some advice, my 2 cents or whatever it's worth in terms of how to approach this vast opportunity of research and grant writing. I am a school psychologist by training, and so my early work was very much in the field and very applied. I worked in schools with an EDS degree in school psychology and practice as a specialist level psychologist out of that. And so I worked in the schools and worked a lot with teachers and children who had special needs, educational challenges, social emotional difficulties. And right away, realized how much I really didn't know. So that whole expert hat was something that I've always been uncomfortable wearing. But realized very quickly that the real impact that we can have with children and the real difference that we can make in their lives is not so much on what we do with them, but it's through the work that we do with families and teachers and other supports and caregivers in their lives. So it's really kind of giving away a lot of the skills and tools that we have. And I've progressed, my whole career has kind of progressed that way and thinking about how can we give away what we know and do, whether it's in practice or clinical work or in research, so that collectively we're all benefiting. Families has always been sort of the underlying common denominator of my work, family-school interface, the way that we can really influence and impact families. And we weren't doing that in education at the time. So when I went on to my doctorate at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, I really looked for ways to bring that in. Well, even my major advisor, who was one of the biggest researchers in the field of school psychology, continues to be, was doing nothing with families and a lot of work with classrooms, a lot of work with teachers, but the kid is in school from 9 until 3, and when they go home, and it's like they don't exist anymore. So I created a model of intervention that really brought families and kids together. There's a graphic, and 2 graphics in front of you, and they really represent an ecological model of intervening with kids, and they represent this model of intervention that I developed that really kind of brought families and schools and other support systems together. And the reason I put that on the sheet is because one of the first messages that I wanted to really have you think about is the passion behind the work that we do, and you have to be passionate about the research. I became passionate because I work in the field and I work with children, real children who have real issues, and families who we weren't connected with in a meaningful way. And that became really and continues to be the main thrust of my work, but it's because of the experiences that I live day in and day out as a practitioner. And that those conceptual frameworks and models really have continued to permeate throughout all the work that I do. I guess the other aspect of that and the representation of the models really kind of drives home the fact that we are not in this alone. Whether it's from a practice perspective, a clinical perspective, a research perspective, none of what we do should ever be done on an island. And the work of families and schools and interconnection, relationship with one another is a really concrete example of how it's those collective work that's done that really makes an impact, whether it's in children's lives or from a research perspective. It's the interdisciplinary, collaborative work that really makes a big difference. And again, that's sort of been a driving message in my work, is reaching out, working with others, bringing important support systems together, finding ways that we can support and bolster whatever it is that we're working toward by engaging in these efforts together. So that passion really has to drive what you do, and that underlying theme of interdisciplinary, collaborative work is something that I'll come back to in a minute, because it really is what it's about now in grant writing and type of funding as well. My 2 cents, for whatever they're worth, in terms of grant writing and research. I'm going to have to actually look at this copy this myself, but I keep catching that I already said number 1, so there you go. That was 1 cent. Okay, now the rest. There's 6 words that I learned very early on in my career. It was a colleague of mine that taught me this, and I still think of it to this day. Think big, start small, and go slow. I think these still are very true today. Think big. When you're thinking about your research, think of long-term goals. Think of where you want to be 10 years from now, not necessarily tomorrow. It's important that you start small and start chipping away at those goals in a very systematic, methodical, planful way. But don't lose sight of that big picture. Don't lose sight of what you're really about and what you're working toward. It's really important. Otherwise, you'll have a series of projects that you'll be working on over the course of several years. But if you don't have that vision and that mission, that big idea, you won't have a systematic agenda for your research, and you'll have a lot of stop gaps that are kind of fill things in along the way, but it won't have that whole meaning for you, and you'll tire easily of that. Start small. That's not necessarily in a meaningless way. It's really what Marc was talking about. Find out what is manageable, what's doable. My first grant was $5,000. In my first year as an assistant professor at the University of Utah, and there was a mechanism. It was internal. It was akin to what our research council offers here, or the layman grants offers here, although they're larger than 5,000. There we were, we didn't have quite as many resources for research, but I still got a lot of mileage out of a $5,000 grant. I got a couple of those. They're great. They allow you to collect pilot data, to get some seed money, to do some testing of your ideas. You get a lot of mileage out of that, and get some pubs out while you're going for those other grants and things that they're still floating. I like that word. Until you hit. And don't go after those great big grants that are possible for all of us to get. Be very thoughtful and systematic about your approach. Sometimes the first federal grant I got, and I submitted a lot of grants before anything got funded. A lot of grants. One of the things that really capped it for me was taking a trip to Washington, D.C. and visiting with some grant officers. As a brand new assistant professor, I was probably in the field for just a couple of years. I went on my own, and I did some homework, and I set up a lot of meetings, and they were fabulous. Most of my early grants were through the U.S. Department of Education. A lot of my grants continue to be through the U.S. Department of Ed. I met a lot of people there. I went jogging over the lunch hour with one of them because that's when he had time to do it, and even though I had just had a baby like 3 months earlier, and I was not in my best running shape. And he was fast. He ran like 15 miles. Very humbling. But it's what you do. And at that same visit then, I was able to get on some grant review panels. So I came back to Washington, D.C. a couple months later and reviewed grants. And that's really what opened my eyes. It's the same thing. I was able to look at examples, samples, and everything. But when I actually been on a panel and heard the discussions and got involved in making some of the recommendations for funding, that really turned it for me because you see it in a whole bunch. So I really didn't start getting funding until 1994 was my first private grant. It was a few years into my career. But that's why I put in parentheses be tenacious. You have to really be persistent. Play well with others. We have to, now more than